He thought he was just preparing pumpkins for sale. But when one of them split open and revealed what was hidden inside, his entire life turned into a federal investigation. So watch until the end and tell us in the comments, what would you have done in his place? The last days of October brought a damp chill to the Hill family farm, the kind that settled into the wood of the old barn and made every hinge groan when it moved. Tom Hill stood in the doorway of the barn that morning, letting his eyes adjust to the pale gray light that filtered through the clouds. The fields beyond were still wrapped in the kind of fog that softened the edges of everything, turning the world into a muted watercolor. But even through that haze, the pumpkins stood out, the bright oranges and dusty yellows that were supposed to save the farm this year. He told himself that the field looked like money, like overdue relief, like a chance to prove that one good harvest could still turn things around. But the rest of the farm told a different story. The far side of the barn roof was still patched with 2 tarps from the late summer storm that had ripped shingles off like paper. The beams over the feed room bowed faintly under their own weight. A small stack of unopened envelopes sat on the table just inside the doorway, 2 from the bank, 1 from the supply company, 1 marked "Final Notice" in red ink. Tom didn't need to open any of them. He knew what they said. He had read too many just like them already. He ran a hand through his unshaven jaw and forced himself to step out into the morning air. Today wasn't for worrying. Today was for work, and work was something he still knew how to do better than anything. The pumpkins were ready for shipment, 500 of them, maybe more, and the buyers for the county Halloween festival were counting on size, color, and weight. Tom had signed contracts. The farm didn't have many chances left, but this was one of them. He grabbed the old scale he used every season and wheeled it out toward the loading area. The pumpkins were arranged in neat rows, just the way he preferred, sorted by type and size so that no customer would accuse him of mixing batches. The fog had started to lift, revealing more of the field, and Tom felt the small spark of satisfaction that came only from harvest time. These pumpkins were bigger than last year's rounder, denser, some heavy enough he needed both arms to lift them. He had even started believing this might be the year he didn't have to choose which bills to ignore. But then something interrupted the rhythm. He set one of the largest pumpkins onto the scale and frowned. The weight flashed higher than he expected, far higher. 15 pounds heavier than the others of the same size. He recalibrated the scale, but the number didn't change. The pumpkin felt wrong, less natural heft, more dead weight, like lifting a stone instead of produce. He turned it over, pressing his hand along the rind. The skin felt normal, tough and waxy, but as he rotated it, something caught the light. A faint seam, almost invisible unless someone was looking for it, like a line where 2 halves had once been separated and then sealed back together. He brushed his thumb along it, and the texture was different from the rest of the rind, slightly smoother, less organic. He straightened up and scanned the rest of the pile. Now that he knew to look for it, he saw more of them, maybe a dozen pumpkins with subtle irregularities. A curve where it shouldn't be, an area of rind that seemed too perfectly shaped, too untouched by the natural scuffs of the field. A thought flickered in him, something uneasy and half-formed, but he pushed it down before it could become real. Maybe it was just a variation of the crop. Maybe the fertilizer had changed the density. Maybe... He sliced the first pumpkin open 3 hours later. It wasn't part of the plan. He had only meant to remove the top and check the seeds, maybe trim a portion for storage. Instead, something in him insisted on knowing. The knife went in smoothly, too smoothly. The rind parted without the resistance he was used to. Then the blade hit something firm and artificial and stopped. The pumpkin didn't split the way pumpkins should. Its halves clung together until he pried them apart, and when they did, the truth spilled out from the hollow cavity inside. Plastic-wrapped, vacuum-sealed bricks of white powder, packed tightly, layered with precision, protected from moisture and decay. Tom did not say a word. His breath hitched in his throat, and he stepped back so fast that the knife clattered against the table. The bricks were stamped with numbers, shipment codes, expiration dates, nothing he recognized, but everything about them screamed illegal. He had seen images like this on the news. Drugs found in cargo shipments, cocaine seizures at the border, busts worth millions, but never inside a pumpkin, never on his farm. His first instinct was disbelief, an insistence that someone else must have done this. Someone who had access to the field, someone who had used his land without him knowing. His second instinct was fear. As he stared at the hollowed pumpkin on the table, a cold wave settled into his chest. Whoever had used his field had done it quietly, carefully, and confidently. That meant they'd been here before, maybe more than once. That meant they were willing to take risks on his land. That meant they were close. He forced himself to look again at the interior wall of the pumpkin. That faint seam on the outside was far more obvious on the inside. The cavity had clearly been carved when the fruit was still small, then resealed with what looked like plant-based adhesive enough to heal and keep the pumpkin growing until harvest. Someone had taken advantage of nature to build their own delivery system. They hadn't needed trucks or crates or docks, just a farm and time. Tom's thoughts spiraled, but a stronger one cut through them. This wasn't just about the drugs. This was about his name, his land, his family. If the wrong people found this here before he called anyone, they would think he was part of it. If the right people found it law enforcement, they would still question whether he knew. And if the people who put this here realized one of their shipments had been discovered. He looked toward the house, toward the window where his wife might already be awake. No one else knew what he had just found. Not yet. He needed to do the right thing. But the right thing suddenly looked dangerous in every direction. He didn't get a choice about whether the situation would become worse. It became worse the moment he picked up a second pumpkin. He lifted it, testing the weight, even heavier than the first. And when he cut it open, the contents were not soft plastic bricks. They were metal, a cylindrical capsule, smooth and cold, resting inside the hollowed center like a seed planted with purpose. There was no label, but there was a serial number, laser-etched along the side. He lifted it with a rag too carefully to be accidental and saw a small puncture seal near the top, something meant to be opened only with tools. If the bricks had frightened him, the capsule terrified him. Drugs could ruin a life. Whatever this was felt capable of destroying far more. He did not touch it again. He covered both pumpkins and stepped back, as if distance could undo what he had found. He picked up the phone with hands that barely obeyed him and dialed the only number that made sense, 911, and when the operator answered, his voice shook. By the time the first police cars arrived, he had already marked off the area, written down the exact times and locations, and organized the other suspicious pumpkins so they wouldn't be touched. It didn't matter. The officers still treated him like the criminal. He was questioned, escorted away from the table, told repeatedly not to touch anything. One of the officers radioed for backup after testing the white bricks. The result came back positive for cocaine, high purity. The capsule was brought to the attention of someone with a different badge, someone who ordered everyone to step back until the hazmat vehicle arrived. Then came the words Tom would never forget. Possible biological substance, unknown classification. Something inside him cracked not with panic, but with a cold, heavy realization. He had assumed the drugs were the worst of it. He had been wrong. The farm was no longer a farm. It was a crime scene, and he was no longer a farmer. He was a suspect, a witness, and possibly the only person who had seen something he was never meant to see. When the federal vehicles arrived, the tone changed. The men in suits didn't shout. They didn't accuse. They simply documented, collected, measured. They moved with the calm of people who had done this before, but not often, and never where pumpkins grew. Tom was escorted away from the field and into the house, where he was told to wait for questioning. He sat at the kitchen table, staring at the grain in the wood, knowing everything about his life had split open just like the pumpkin. Only what spilled out of his life wasn't white powder or metal, but everything he stood to lose. Outside, engines rumbled, cases were sealed, cameras clicked. Someone cordoned off the entire field with biohazard tape. And as the sun began to rise above the fog, Tom caught sight of a truck on the distant road, its taillights vanishing behind the trees. It was moving fast, too fast for a normal delivery truck, and no one but him seemed to notice it was leaving the direction of his land. That was when the final, undeniable truth settled into place. Someone else knew the pumpkins had been found, someone who was never supposed to be seen. And they were already gone. He didn't know yet what the capsule contained. He didn't know yet how long the operation on his land had been running. He didn't know yet whether he would be punished or protected. But he did know one thing, with the certainty of someone who had no choice left but to believe it. Nothing about this harvest was an accident, and whatever had begun on his field was far from over. The following day began not with the quiet routine of farm life, but with the sound of unfamiliar vehicles rolling across Tom Hill's gravel drive. The field had been fenced off overnight, the pumpkins no longer glowing in open sunlight, but trapped behind warning tape marked in black and yellow. The men in protective suits were still there at dawn, their movements slow and deliberate, as if every object they touched might detonate or infect. Tom watched from the kitchen window as two more official cars arrived, unmarked but unmistakably federal, and felt the reality tighten around him like a closing fist. He stepped outside only when instructed, escorted by a local officer who tried to act familiar but could not hide the caution in his voice. The air had changed. Every word anyone spoke was recorded. Every step he took was observed. His own land felt like foreign territory, and he was no longer its owner, just a figure being studied, measured, and judged. The lead agent, a tall man with a badge clipped to his belt, repeated what the police had already told him the night before. The cocaine was confirmed. The metal capsule was being analyzed by a federal laboratory. More than a dozen pumpkins were suspected to contain contraband. The agent's tone was calm, but each statement carried a weight Tom couldn't escape. The capsule, he explained, was sealed for a reason. The substance inside had not yet been identified. That meant it could be harmless, or it could be something built to spread silently through a crowd. And Halloween was 3 days away. Tom answered every question honestly. He listed every worker he had hired that season, every delivery he had expected, every visitor who had set foot on the property. But no matter how much he said, he could see it in the agent's face, the same question flickering behind his eyes, unspoken but present. How could something this large, this organized, have happened on his land without him knowing? The only answer was the one the agent feared most. Either Tom was lying, or the people behind this operation were good enough to infiltrate a farm without being seen. Neither possibility made the situation safer. By noon, the agents had expanded the quarantine zone and moved from gathering evidence to interviewing neighbors. Word spread faster than any official briefing could contain. People in town no longer asked what happened. They asked what Tom had done. Someone posted an anonymous message online claiming the Hill farm had been under investigation for months. Someone else added that the owner had ties to cartel shipments from the border. None of it was true, but truth moved no faster than the fog that had settled across the property, slow, blurred, and easy to reshape. The first sign that the town had already chosen a side came when Tom drove into town to pick up supplies. The cashier at the grocery store, who had known his family for years, didn't make eye contact. The couple behind him in line stopped whispering only when he turned. At the feed store, the clerk who normally joked about weather didn't speak more than 2 clipped words. Even the pastor's wife, who had once brought casseroles after Tom's father died, crossed the street when she saw him coming. It wasn't anger. It was fear, and fear was far harder to argue with. Back at the house, his wife had been listening to the radio. A short report had aired. A farm under federal investigation, illegal substances discovered, possible biohazard involvement. They didn't say Tom's name, but they didn't need to. In a town with only one farm large enough to grow hundreds of pumpkins, the hint was enough. His daughter came home from school with rumors already circulating. Someone claimed the farm had been shut down because Tom had been dealing drugs for years. Someone else said the pumpkins were poisoned. Children had a way of repeating what adults believed, but weren't willing to say out loud. The field outside the house now looked like a wound sealed under plastic. Biohazard tape fluttered in the wind like banners of accusation. Tom stood at the edge of the property and stared at it, not as a farmer but as a man caught in the machinery of something far larger than him. Every hour that passed made one thing clearer. Someone had used his land the way people use a shield, because a farm is a place no one expects to find danger. But the more he thought about the pumpkins, the seams, the weight, the unmarked truck in the distance, the more he understood that this hadn't been a single act, but a system. Someone had been on his land when he was asleep. Someone had lifted pumpkins while they were still small, opened them, planted their payloads, and left without leaving a trace. Someone knew his schedule, his blind spots, his habits. Someone had watched him long before he ever noticed anything was wrong. That night, Tom walked the perimeter of the field with a flashlight, the beam catching impressions in the ground. Another set of tire tracks, too narrow to be from his truck. Footprints near the fence line, the faint imprint of something that looked like a wheeled dolly, the kind used to transport crates. No one had permission to be on his land. No one had asked. No one had been seen. But someone had been here. He took pictures. He made notes. He placed empty cans on strings across the back gate as improvised alarms. It was all he could do. The police had done their version of an inspection, but their circle of interest didn't reach the details Tom saw because no one else had lived on this land as long as he had. No one else could tell the difference between a tire mark made by a tractor and one made by a van. And then the first threat arrived. It wasn't dramatic. Just a plastic grocery bag left hanging from the gate post the next morning. Inside was a dead sparrow with a broken neck. No note, no symbol. Just the unmistakable message that Tom had stepped into something he was not meant to see, not meant to speak about, and not meant to survive if he made the wrong choice. His wife found it before he did. That was the part that made it feel different. Not like intimidation, but like intrusion. They weren't warning him. They were reminding him they already knew where he lived, what he cared about, and how to reach him without being noticed. The fear in his family's eyes hurt more than the threat itself. The police took the bird away as evidence, but the look they gave him afterward was worse than silence. It said they had seen this before. It said they had no way to protect him from it. By afternoon, Tom had been questioned again by 2 different federal officers, this time with sharper phrasing, fewer courtesies, and more emphasis on the timeline of his actions. They weren't accusing him outright, but they were preparing the structure of an accusation, the kind that could be used in court if cooperation ever turned into hostility. He understood the implication clearly. If he failed to help them, they would have every reason to assume he was involved. And if he helped them too much, the people who had put the capsules in the pumpkins would see him as a liability. There was no place left to stand that wasn't dangerous. But danger, he realized, was not the same as helplessness. He still knew the land better than anyone. He still knew which areas of the farm no police officer or agent had checked. And he still knew where someone might stash supplies if they needed to move quickly under cover of darkness. He walked to the far edge of the property as dusk settled, the fog returning like a memory of the morning before. There, hidden behind an overgrown tree line and nearly swallowed by weeds, stood a small storage shed no one ever used anymore. The padlock was old, the wood blistered, the hinges rusted, but the earth around the door was disturbed. Fresh tracks led to it. The weeds were pushed flat. Someone had been here recently. That was when Tom understood something that changed everything. The police had searched the pumpkins, but not the land. The FBI had investigated the immediate crime, but not the larger pattern. The criminals had used the farm not because it was convenient, but because it was trusted. He had been thinking like a farmer. He needed to start thinking like the people who had turned his field into a shipping line. He needed to investigate, not wait. For the first time since the nightmare began, Tom didn't feel only cornered. He felt something closer to purpose. Fear could not protect his family. Caution could not fix what had been done. The only path forward was to find out who was using his land and how deep the operation went. As he returned to the house, he passed the taped-off pumpkins and the floodlights the agents had left running through the night. He didn't look at them the way he had the day before. He didn't see fruit or loss or evidence. He saw a map, a pattern, a trail that ran through his field like veins under skin, carrying something meant to poison far more than soil. He wasn't waiting anymore. He would track the next step before someone else erased the trail. Inside the house, he gathered a notebook, a flashlight, gloves, and a camera. The shed would be the first place he checked. Then the tree line. Then the far ridge by the old fence post where he'd once found broken glass that didn't come from any jar he had ever owned. He didn't know yet who was behind this, or how long they had been operating, or what the capsule was intended to do. But he knew now that every answer was still on his land, and he was the only one who could find it before the people who planted it returned to cover their tracks. The night closed in around the farm as he stepped out again, alone, but no longer unsure. Whatever had started here wasn't finished, and neither was he. Tom left the house that night without telling his wife where he was going, though she could read the truth in his face as clearly as if he had spoken it. She didn't try to stop him. She only asked when he would be back. He didn't answer because he didn't know. He had crossed a line the moment he told himself he couldn't rely on the police or the federal agents. Now, every step he took was on territory no one could protect him from, not the law, not the people behind the operation, and not even the land he had spent his whole life trusting. The shed stood at the far end of the property, half swallowed by brush, too far from the house to be seen from any window. The padlock was rusted, the kind that should have resisted movement, but when Tom lifted it, it clicked open too easily. Someone had replaced the inside pin. It was the kind of change no one would notice unless they had touched that lock for 20 years. He pushed the door open and felt his throat tighten. The interior no longer smelled of dust and old fencing wire. It smelled of chemicals, sharp, plasticky, the kind used in packaging plants and industrial sealants. The floor was littered with scraps of material he had never owned. Narrow coils of synthetic thread, pieces of heat-resistant plastic, and a roll of metallic tape. A pair of latex gloves was draped over a crate. Next to it was a spool of twine identical to the kind he had found stuck to the inside of the tampered pumpkins. And in the corner, stacked neatly as if waiting for the next visit, were flattened cardboard boxes printed with a barcode and the letters SB no brand name, no seller address, no purchase order. His heart didn't race. It dropped, heavy as a stone. This wasn't carelessness. This was storage. He took pictures of everything, cataloging it the way the agents might have done if they had bothered to look deeper than the pumpkins themselves. When he finished, he crouched to examine the dust near the entrance. The footprints were fresh, not boots, running shoes, different sizes, at least 2 people. The marks led out of the shed in a direction that didn't connect to the gravel drive or the barn, but toward the tree line, where a narrow path cut through the grass. A path that had never been there before the past week. Someone had been moving through his property like it was a corridor. He followed the trail through the trees, keeping his light low, listening for anything other than the sound of his own steps. The ground dipped into a shallow trench that ran parallel to the fence and then rose again near the edge of the old service road. He remembered the road as a child, once used for deliveries, and later cracked and abandoned when larger highways redirected traffic. The town had stopped paving it a decade ago. It was the perfect place to enter land unseen. At the bottom of the trench, half buried in leaves, was a strip of plastic sheeting, the same kind used to wrap pallets in a truck. Someone had hidden their movements, protected the cargo, and left nothing exposed to the soil. It confirmed what he feared. This wasn't the beginning of the operation. It was the middle of it, maybe the end. He followed the trench upward until he reached a point where the trees thinned. Through the branches, he could see the faint outline of the abandoned warehouse on the other side of the service road. It had once belonged to a local lumber company, shut down years ago after bankruptcy. The roof had collapsed in places, and the windows were boarded. No one had reason to be there. No one except the kind of people who needed to hide something in plain sight. His pulse steadied, not from calm, but from decision. He would go inside. The warehouse door was chained, but not locked, an illusion of security. One tug from a bolt cutter would free it. Inside, the air was thick with dust, but not entirely still. Someone had been here recently. A light source had been used. There were faint burn marks from a portable lamp. He stepped deeper, shining his flashlight along the floor where tire tracks formed shallow crescents in the dirt. They didn't belong to cars. They were too narrow. Dollies, transport carts. He'd seen the same wheel width in the marks behind the shed. Further in, he found the staging area. A wooden table covered with flattened pumpkins, each one split open with surgical precision. The insides had been scraped clean and replaced with white residue shavings of hardened plant resin, the same adhesive used to seal the pumpkins afterward. Next to the table were stacks of vacuum bags, some empty, others still holding residue from narcotic packaging. The equipment wasn't homemade, it was professional, portable, and efficient. And then he found the ledger. A thick notebook with no cover, just page after page of dates, weights, codes, and initials. Not names, never names, but numbers he recognized from his own shipment records. Someone had recorded every pumpkin used, every concealed package, every retrieval date. And buried 3 pages in was an entry that made the entire operation widen into something far beyond drug trafficking. Code 7B41, 12CT, marked B, deliver pre-HLW, HLW, Halloween, 12 pumpkins marked B. The same letter stamped on the capsule he had found. That meant the drugs were not the end of the operation. They were the camouflage for something worse. The cocaine inside the pumpkins had been designed to distract, to explain the weight, to give law enforcement a reason to stop looking once they found it. No one was supposed to cut open the second pumpkin. No one was supposed to find the capsule. And no one was supposed to be alive long enough to ask questions about what it was meant to do. He took more pictures, every page, every code, every piece of evidence he could carry. It wasn't until he closed the notebook that the silence in the warehouse changed. A creak near the entrance. Not wood settling. Footsteps. Tom ducked behind a stack of crates, killed the flashlight, and held his breath. The steps were slow, cautious, not panicked. Whoever was entering wasn't afraid of being caught. That meant they believed they were alone. That meant they had been here before. A thin beam of light swept across the floor. It paused near the table, near the ledger still slightly disturbed from where he had moved it. The person stiffened. The flashlight rose. Tom moved backward as slowly as he could, feeling the outline of a side door he had passed earlier. If he was lucky, he could exit without being seen. If he wasn't. The flashlight cut across the crates and stopped just before reaching him. He froze, knowing that even the slightest movement could catch the light. The person exhaled softly, lifted the ledger, flipped through the pages, and made a low sound of irritation. Tom heard a cell phone vibrate, muffled by a pocket, followed by a voice too low to make out words. A second voice responded farther away, outside the warehouse, near a vehicle. There were two of them, and he knew now, without question, that they weren't delivering anything tonight. They were cleaning up. The ledger snapped shut. Tom waited until the footsteps faded toward the far-loading door. He slipped out the side exit and ran through the trees, keeping low, not daring to use the flashlight. Only when he reached the fence line of his own property did he stop running long enough to breathe. By the time he made it home, his hands were shaking, not from exertion but from clarity. He had found proof. Proof of the drug operation, proof of the tampered pumpkins, proof of a second cargo meant for an entirely different purpose. But he had not found what the capsule contained, or who was behind the financing, or why his farm had been chosen. And as he stood at the edge of the porch, he could see the house had been disturbed again. A chair on its side, a porch light unscrewed, a shadow of intrusion, not vandalism. Someone had been close enough to study the doors, close enough to test the silence inside. He entered the house quietly, checked every room, then the backyard, then the barn. Nothing missing, nothing taken, nothing broken. But someone had been there. He didn't need a note this time. The message was already clear. They knew he had gone looking. They knew he had seen something he wasn't supposed to see. He couldn't give the evidence to the local police. He couldn't trust the officials who were already convinced he might be involved. And he couldn't wait for the investigation to play out. Not when the people who had infiltrated his land were already watching him more closely than the agents were. He needed someone outside the circle, someone not tied to the county, not tied to the sheriff, not tied to the people who were protecting the staging area at the warehouse. He remembered the name of one FBI agent who hadn't treated him like a suspect during questioning, an agent who had taken time to explain procedures, not intimidate him. Someone who had quietly slipped him a card, almost as if anticipating what might happen if the investigation was mishandled. He found the card in the drawer under the phone. He stared at it, weighing the risk of calling one person within the same agency that had already seen pieces of the truth. But if he did nothing, the people behind the pumpkins would finish their work long before the government finished its paperwork. He dialed the number. The agent didn't answer. The voicemail didn't identify the government office, only a tone. Tom kept his voice steady but not vague. Something had been missed. Something was still active. He had proof. He had photos. He had routes and timestamps. He hung up. He pulled out a second envelope and filled it with printed photos, along with a written statement of everything he had discovered. He sealed it and wrote the name of a local reporter he trusted. Not for now. For when there was no other way left to reveal the truth. Before bed, he went to the attic and hid the envelope behind a loose board. If those men came back during the night, they would not find it. He slept lightly, waking at every sound, every shift of wind, every creak of wood settling under the cold. But it wasn't fear that kept him awake anymore. Fear had already done its part. Now something stronger had taken its place, resolve, heavy and sharp as a blade. Whatever this was, whoever was behind it, however dangerous it had become, he knew one thing with absolute certainty. They had made a mistake by choosing his farm, and he was done being the one who didn't see what was happening. The night after Tom made the call, he waited for a response that didn't come. He checked the phone more times than he cared to admit, half expecting the agent to return the call and half expecting an unknown number to appear instead, the kind that never left voicemail because it didn't need to. When morning arrived, it brought only silence and a gray sky rolling in from the west like a slow-moving storm. The house felt too still. His wife moved through the rooms quietly, speaking only when necessary, watching their daughter with the worry of someone who had already imagined the worst. Tom understood. The danger was no longer invisible. It was present in every creak of the porch, every unattended truck that slowed when passing the farm, every anonymous vehicle idling near the turn to the service road. The farm, once an open place, now felt like a trap. It wasn't until late morning that the phone finally rang. The number was not the one from the agent's card, but the voice on the other end identified herself as his colleague, speaking on a secure line. She didn't waste time with introductions. She only confirmed she had received the message, reviewed the photos, and wanted to meet in person. Her tone did not carry suspicion, only urgency. They arranged to meet 3 miles outside town, at a rest area overlooking the river where no one would question parked cars. Tom left the farm in a truck that looked older than its engine, hoping it wouldn't draw attention. On the way, he checked his mirrors more often than he watched the road ahead. The agent arrived in a nondescript government sedan, not marked but not pretending to be anything else. She looked younger than the others he had met, too thoughtful to be blindly procedural, too observant to waste time with small talk. She accepted the photographs, reviewed the notebook entries, and asked questions that made it clear she understood the difference between a frightened man and someone who had stumbled into something worth burying. She confirmed what Tom already suspected, that the local FBI office had received pressure to reduce the scope of the investigation, that the discovery of narcotics had satisfied the minimum threshold of action, and anything beyond that would require more proof, more risk, more political inconvenience. She was not part of the local office. She was here because someone else had passed her the message. Tom saw in her the first ally who didn't assume he was the moral center of a crime or a liability to a case. She saw a witness who refused to drown quietly. Together they structured a plan. Not a dramatic one, no arrests, no raids, no direct confrontations. Not yet. They would collect more evidence, confirm the route of distribution, and intercept the next movement of the disguised pumpkins before they reached their intended destination. If they could secure a full shipment containing both the narcotics and the capsules, the case would force federal action from higher authority. Tom agreed, not because he wanted justice, but because he wanted the people behind this to be visible, not shadows with keys to his land. The night that followed felt different from the others, not lighter, but focused. The agent's team secretly installed cameras at the abandoned warehouse, placed a tracking device on the transport route leading from the service road, and positioned unmarked vehicles beyond the ridge where no one from the farm could be connected to the surveillance. Tom did his part. He returned to the field, checking for new disturbances, mapping the weight of pumpkins left untouched, confirming the subtle markers carved into certain stems. By evening, everything was in place. But the closer the hour came, the more Tom sensed something he hadn't anticipated. The criminals were changing their rhythm. He could feel it in the stillness of the field, the absence of motion where there should have been examination or retrieval. He didn't know how he knew, only that people who hid things this well were also people who knew how to disappear before anyone reached them. He stayed up late, sitting on the porch steps, listening for any sound that didn't belong. It came just after midnight, faint but recognizable, the low rumble of an engine designed not to draw attention, the rustle of wheels moving over grass instead of road, the deliberate quiet of people who assumed no one was watching. But someone was watching. Not just Tom. Federal eyes were now watching too. He texted the agent the signal they'd agreed upon, movement on the field. Within minutes, she confirmed her team had detected activity near the warehouse. Then came a second message. They weren't loading. They were clearing. It took him a moment to understand. They were not retrieving pumpkins for distribution. They were removing evidence. Something had spooked them. Maybe they knew about the hazmat testing on the capsule. Maybe they had seen the police cars coming and going. Maybe someone inside law enforcement had warned them to shut down the operation. That possibility chilled Tom more than anything he had discovered in the shed. He told the agent where the transport trail left the property. She confirmed her team was moving to intercept, but the wording changed. No longer a planned operation, but a salvage attempt. The criminals were leaving, abandoning the warehouse and the field, taking what they could before disappearing behind whatever connections had protected them so far. 3 vehicles were detected on the warehouse cameras. 1 van, 1 box truck, 1 pickup. They weren't careless. They burned the documents they didn't need. They stripped the work tables. They smashed equipment instead of leaving it. They took only sealed freight pumpkins that had already been prepared, loaded, and marked for delivery. It was all happening faster than Tom had imagined, faster than the federal team had planned for. And before anyone could respond, the agent sent the message no one wanted to write. "We have a leak." Tom read the words twice, feeling the full weight of them settle in his chest. Someone within the investigation had warned the very people they were trying to catch, someone with access to evidence, access to the sealed scene, access to the details only investigators knew. There was no way the criminals would have known which pumpkins were still safe and which were compromised unless someone had told them. The agent didn't say who she suspected, but Tom didn't need her to. There were only a handful of officials who had seen the seized capsule, only a handful who knew the FBI lab was running tests, only a handful who had authority to shift the case downward instead of upward. Someone high enough to redirect an investigation, but low enough to disappear if anything went wrong. The operation collapsed in real time. The warehouse was half emptied by the time the unmarked cars arrived. The criminals scattered before the first arrest could be made. 1 man was taken into custody, but he refused to speak. The trucks were stopped miles apart, but only one contained pumpkins. Not the pumpkins they needed, not the ones marked for Halloween, not the ones with the capsules. The criminals had already moved the real shipment. Tom waited for morning with a heavy certainty, the kind that scraped at the inside of the ribs. He didn't blame the agent. She had tried, but what they had run into was larger than a hidden operation on farmland. This was a chain of people, protected by someone who stood far enough from the ground to avoid suspicion, but close enough to the money to benefit from it. The sun rose on a burned corner of the warehouse, shattered equipment, and a half-missing ledger. The farm received no relief. The people behind the pumpkins were still unknown. The capsule still held its secret. And now, there was no doubt left. The safety of the investigation had been compromised. The safety of Tom's family had been compromised. The truth was no longer an objective. It was a risk, shared between too few people and valued by none of the ones in power. And then, as if to underline what had already been shown with silence and shadows, Tom returned home to find something waiting for him on the front step. A stone. A small one. Clean but heavy. Wrapped in paper with a single line written in ink. "You're done now. Stay done." There was no anger left in Tom by then. Only clarity. These people didn't threaten twice. They threatened once, then acted. If he walked away, they would move forward with their plan and vanish again. If he didn't walk away, they would trade caution for finality. But the choice was not about safety anymore. It was about who controlled the truth, those who used it as a weapon, or those who refused to bury it. He picked up the stone, turned it over in his hand, and dropped it into the dirt. He would not be done. Not until the people who planted poison in pumpkins were no longer protected by power and silence. Not until someone besides him understood what was coming. Not until the truth was too public to kill. The threat left on the doorstep did not change Tom's decision. It only confirmed that he no longer had the illusion of safety to lose. The operation on his farm was shutting down, the criminals were already shifting into escape, and the people meant to investigate them had fractured from inside. If he backed away now, the trail would disappear, the evidence would be dismissed, and whatever had been planned for Halloween would happen as quietly as the pumpkins had been filled. The only way to stop it was to make the truth too loud to be ignored. The first step was to remove the story from the people who wanted it controlled. The packet he had hidden in the attic, the one containing the photographs, the notes, the evidence he had gathered when no one was watching, was no longer a backup. It was the front line. He added the newest pieces: the ledger pages from the warehouse, the photos of the tampered pumpkins still untouched in the field, the timestamps proving movement after the quarantine. He sealed the envelope and drove it himself to the town's small post office, where he mailed it directly to the investigative journalist he trusted. Not a local news anchor, not someone who took state money, someone who understood that a story with no permission was the only kind worth publishing. From there, he returned to the farm and called the agent. She didn't answer at first, and he feared she had been silenced the same way the operation had been. But she called back 30 minutes later, speaking in a clipped tone that told him she was moving quickly, not freely. She had taken his information and brought it outside the jurisdiction of the compromised office. A federal prosecutor in another district had agreed to review the case if there was enough evidence to force escalation. So Tom gathered the rest. That afternoon, he walked the field for the last time not as a farmer, but as a witness restoring the truth. He photographed every marked pumpkin still in the soil, every stem with the razor-thin incision, every row that had been tampered with. He documented the trench lines where carts had moved, the tire tracks leading toward the service road, the boot print near the shed door. He left nothing undocumented, not the smallest scrap of adhesive, nor the torn drop cloth near the fence. As he worked, he felt the field shifting in meaning. The earth he had spent a lifetime turning for food now turned against what had been hidden inside it. The pumpkins were no longer harvest or loss or shame. They were proof, and proof was the only thing that could cut through the silence of power. By evening, he had filled 2 hard drives with files. One he kept, one he sent with the agent, a third he stored in an off-site safe deposit box in a town no one associated with him. He understood now that truth was not protected by being held. It was protected by being impossible to erase. The agent called again 3 hours after sunset, with the update he had been hoping for, not the end of the case, but the beginning of the unavoidable part. Based on the evidence he had provided, a multi-agency team had agreed to conduct coordinated raids on 3 linked sites: a warehouse near the state line, a storage facility registered to a shell company connected to the same serial codes, and a shipping terminal where a flagged cargo lot was scheduled to move on Halloween morning. It was no longer an internal investigation. It was a federal operation. Tom stayed awake through the night, receiving fragments of information as the raids unfolded. One location was hit first, with several low-level couriers detained and narcotics seized in bulk quantities. The second was slower, more resistance, more damage. The third was the priority. It held containers that had already cleared paperwork, already been placed under routine inspection status, already prepared for distribution. The containers were seized. The manifest confirmed what he had feared. Capsules, not drugs, were listed in coded form under agricultural documentation enough to contaminate thousands of people if opened in a public space. That finally was the point where the investigation could no longer be redirected, buried, or quietly dismissed. There was footage. There were seizures. There were arrests on record. The case would go upward whether anyone wanted it to or not. But the names at the top, the financiers, the facilitators, the officials who had allowed the shipments to move without interference were not in handcuffs. Not yet. One of them had already issued a public statement condemning the criminal infiltration of the agricultural sector, a statement so polished that Tom could hear the lie in every sentence. The man wasn't defending the truth. He was defending his distance from it. Soon, that distance would shrink. The next morning, the article went live. Tom knew it the moment his phone began vibrating nonstop. The journalist had published everything: photos, quotes, timelines, testimony, shipping codes, capsule descriptions, copies of the ledger pages, satellite images of the warehouse, and a paragraph identifying the suspicious behavior of the local sheriff's office and the delay in reporting to federal authorities. The story spread faster than any investigation ever could. Within an hour, news networks were calling the farm, not to accuse Tom Hill of criminal activity, but to ask how long he had known, how he had discovered it, how he had protected the evidence when the first authorities failed to. It did not clear him of suspicion in every mind, but it changed the burden of proof. The question was no longer, was he involved? But how deep does this go? He declined all interviews. He had done what he needed to do. The proof was no longer his burden to carry. When the agents returned to the farm, they did not come with caution tape or gloves. They came to secure the remaining pumpkins as federal evidence and formally clear the land for civilian use again. The capsule found in the second pumpkin was confirmed by laboratory analysis to contain a controlled biological toxin, not airborne, but fast-acting if ingested. It was designed to spread through food, not through breath. Pumpkins cut into candy bowls at school fairs. Pumpkins baked into pies. Halloween had not been chosen for symbolism. It had been chosen for convenience. The farm was no longer a crime scene. But it didn't feel like a farm yet either. The pumpkins sat in the field like markers of what had almost happened. What would have happened if Tom had never sliced the first one open? The agent came in person that evening, not in an official capacity, but as someone who had become part of the aftermath. She gave him the confirmation that no one else had delivered yet. The case was now protected under federal jurisdiction, and the people who had tried to bury it had failed. She thanked him, the way one might thank someone who had done something necessary but unwanted, painful but irreplaceable. He didn't feel like a hero. He didn't feel like a survivor. He felt like a man who had lived through something that had taken more than it gave back. The losses were still real. The harvest was gone. The season was ruined. The debts would not disappear because the truth had come to light. The field would need to be replanted with more than seed. But something else happened in the days that followed. Something he had not expected. The people from town who had avoided him before now stopped by the farm with lumber, with supplies, with checks folded into handshakes. Not apologies. Actions. The kind that said they couldn't undo the silence from before, but they weren't going to let the farm rot under the memory of it. The house filled slowly with sounds that had been missing for too long. Hammering, voices, the scrape of tools. Not celebration. Restoration. When the last of the pumpkins were removed from the field, Tom stood alone among the empty rows. The soil looked raw again, bare and honest, without the weight it had carried for months. He knelt and turned the earth with his hand, the way he had done as a child beside his father. He found one pumpkin the agents had missed, not marked, not tampered with, not part of the operation, a perfect one. He cut it open. Inside, there was nothing but seeds and pulp, nothing but what nature intended. He didn't smile, but the knot in his chest loosened. The land was his again, not untouched, not unchanged, but his. There would be another planting season. There would be another harvest. There would be new risks, new debts, new choices, but there would not be silence. Not again. The truth had cost him, but losing it would have cost more. And when he stood up and looked across the field, he did not see what had been done to his farm. He saw what would grow there next. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. There are even more shocking, unbelievable, true story narrations waiting for you on this channel, and the next video is already up. Click over and keep watching. You won't believe what happens there. And if this video surprised you, share it with someone who'll be just as stunned.